path difference is what causes interference. So path difference is really the difference in distances travelled by these two different waves. So S2 travels further, we measured that and saw that S2 was travelling a further distance than S1 was. So it's that difference in distance that creates the interference, because the waves become either in phase or out of phase with each other, dependent upon how the waves are moving. So in this case, the path difference is the difference in this distance and this distance. That's what the path difference will be. For the two different conditions, for constructive and destructive interference, if we start with constructive interference, then you must have a path difference of a multiple of one wavelength. So one wavelength would mean that a peak would meet a peak, a trough would meet a trough, so therefore constructive interference is going to occur. The same can be said if it's 2, 3, 4 or 5 or all whole numbers. Whole numbers of the wavelength will give you constructive interference. So anytime you are looking at a maxima, this is the equation you look at, PD equals n lambda, where n is the order of the fringe. In other words, 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5. For a dark fringe, a minima, which is destructive interference, then that's going to occur when the waves are out of phase by half a wavelength. So half a wavelength, or 1.5 wavelengths, 2.5 wavelengths, 3.5 wavelengths. So that's where this equation comes from. So multiples of a half wavelength. Now, as we discussed, this equation that's given in the data booklet isn't technically correct. This equation will work, n minus a half, but you need to remember to ignore any minus numbers that you might produce from that. So it's n minus a half, because the first order minima is not 1 plus a half, it's 0.5. That's where the confusion comes from. So if we did an example where we look at two different distances travelled, because the waves are out of sync with each other, one's got further to travel than the other, then they become out of phase or in phase. We're looking at a minimum here, so you have to select the correct equation, which is n plus a half. 2.5 is the third order minimum, 4 centimeters.